Hey everyone, and welcome to another episode of Eating at a Meeting. I am Tracy Stuckrath, and we are here this week to talk about how the Food Donation Improvement Act impacts events, hotels, and venues. And I'm very, very excited to bring to you today Emily Broadleib, who is a clinical professor of law and the director of the Harvard Law School Food Law and Policy Clinic. She's a leader in research and action regarding food law and policy, and especially on the issue of food waste reduction. Hello, Emily.
Hello, thank you. Sorry that the title is kind of a mouthful.
No, that's okay. It sounds very, very, very active and professional. So everybody, I have been trying to talk to Emily since this law enacted, but I know there's been lots of things since it got enacted that have to go through. So it's corporate policy month. And so I'm really excited to bring this conversation here at that, and it's also the month of Thanksgiving. So really thinking about giving back and giving to our communities through the donation of excess food. So I'm really excited to talk to you, Emily. So tell us, what does the Food Law and Policy Clinic do?
Great. So this always is like my little PSA for non-lawyers, which is, so clinics in law school are basically like a learning program for law students where they get to do real work before they graduate. So Before the 1970s, law students would go to law school. They would sit in like a lecture hall with, and be lectured at for 3 years. And then they were expected to be professionals. And clinics really started to get them doing real practice while they were here. So mine focuses all on food. And the work that students get to do is really supporting, like, we have clients, we have partners, we're constantly answering legal questions, explaining the law, trying to, like we're going to do today, like take a law and like make it understandable to non-lawyers. And then in a lot of cases, working with our partners that are trying to change the law to figure out how they can do that. So I'm doing that every day. And then I have students that are getting to work on that and learn, and hopefully some of them have gone on to be leaders in this space, both like in government, in other universities, and nonprofits working on food issues.
Well, and you, just before we got started, you said you started this program when you were a fellow. So tell us why you did that.
Great. Let me tell you, I will talk all day about it. So when I went to law school here at Harvard, I left and spent 2 years actually doing work in rural Mississippi around like supporting communities in improving health and economic opportunity. And while I was there, I started getting really into food issues because the community I was working in was asking all these questions. They're like, we want healthier food. We want a lot of, there were new farmers markets springing up, and they had all these questions about the laws around what are we allowed to grow? What are we allowed to sell? So I started doing all this work for them. I ended up coming back to Harvard as a fellow. But I was like, food is so important. We're not talking enough about this. And like, people aren't talking about how much the laws shape what's available and what the costs are and like what's hard to get, what's easy to get. And so I put together a curriculum and started teaching a course as a fellow, and then became a lecturer, and then have been a faculty member here since 2015 and running what is the first food law clinic in the country.
Wow. And there are a lot of food laws, and I was just updating my website. Actually, the food laws I follow generally are around food allergies and, Food Donation Improvement Act and things like that. But there are so many other laws that go into it, which will be a completely different episode that we can talk about.
Yes. I know there are. And that actually was like a point of education I really needed to do with my colleagues on the faculty that kind of saw food law. They thought, oh, it must be so narrow. And it was really educating them. It's actually quite broad. Like it's like safety, it's labeling, it's the First Amendment, it's environmental regulations and subsidies. There's like all these areas of law. So I never get bored.
Wow. Well, that's good. Well, and in the labeling laws are really, in the news lately as well. And actually I posted something, somebody was joking that Costco failed to write that butter contained milk. And they
I just heard about that. It's a labeling issue and a food waste issue. I'm not sure where all that butter went.
That's very true. Yeah. Where did that butter go? Oh my gosh, I didn't even
So
think
what was
about
it?
that
I
aspect.
didn't read the story. I just heard from one of my students. They failed to mention that there was dairy in the butter and therefore had to
Mhm.
recall like a wild
80,000
amount.
pounds.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, so where does that go? Good
I don't
question.
know. We should find out.
Yeah. Oh, I'm gonna dig into that. So that's a whole nother question. So today I want to talk about the Food Donation Improvement Act. And so in my education, when I speak and I talk about this, before it was enacted, there was the Good Samaritan, the George, no, I just
Bill Emerson. Bill
Bill
Emerson.
Emerson Good Samaritan Act. Thank you. That had legal protections on donations, but
Mhm.
this law really, why did the Food Donation Improvement Act have to happen?
It's a great question. So there were, I think, let me start by saying the Bill Emerson Act, like, was and was extremely protective of both the businesses donating food and nonprofit like food banks or food rescue organizations that would receive the donation and then pass it along. But it was old, so it was from
1990?
1997,
Oh, 97. Okay.
97. And it was, really thinking about donation in a way that still exists, like that hasn't gone away, like the kind of traditional food banking model. But in the last, 10, 15 years, there's been a lot more attention on food waste and on food recovery. And there was, I think, an observation that this was actually standing as a barrier to some of the innovation. So the act had three parts to it. Two were included in the final, in what was passed, and one piece was cut out. So the two things that were included in the final act, one was that it expanded the original protection to allow donation from from a business or another entity to a nonprofit that sells the food at a very low price. So before that, it was like the donor and the nonprofit were only protected if the food was given away for free. And I think what we've seen is that it's actually, if we're trying to really scale up food donation, it is not free to, even if the food is free, it's not free to like collect it and transport it and have like the staff that are,
Right.
that are passing it along and storing it and everything. So that was one. And then the other thing that the Food Donation Improvement Act did is that it said for food businesses that have food safety training and expertise, previously they would only be protected if they gave food to a nonprofit that then distributed it. This now protects those food businesses if they also give it away directly. And that, isn't necessarily, again, neither of these are, it's allowing a lot more pathways. It's just saying, let's not be so specific around what the donation needs to look like in order to receive this protection. Let's double down on like, we want safe food to get to people and not be thrown away. And let's double down on like expanding those pathways.
Can I ask what didn't get approved?
Yes. Which I think is actually really relevant to maybe to this audience, is there was a third part of the law that was going to require the U.S. Department of Agriculture to write regulations that really like answered some of the lingering questions about the liability protection. And that got pulled out at the end and wasn't enacted. So I think, to me, one of the big things that we face a lot is I feel like we're constantly answering questions, even with the new law, on the part of businesses saying, am I protected? Am I not protected? And which I think shows both that having the protection is really important and also that we need to maybe have a better solution on making sure people get answers when they have questions.
Well, yeah, because I mean, meeting professionals, and I'm going to count myself in there, and I can tell you on at least a hand in the last 2 years, we can't do that because we're going to get sued. And I do know that part of it's that, but part of it's also the time that it takes to do it. But then again, one meeting planner story that I saw is like a venue, I think it was a convention center, said, hey, we can't do this because we're going to get sued. Well, the meeting planner went out and found a nonprofit in their town that they were meeting and introduced them to the convention center. And now they actually have a strong partnership.
It's great. I love that.
So what are the barriers? I mean, what are the biggest barriers that you've seen, and how has this helped?
Yeah, totally. And I think, I think it's right. Like, having this protection, not having the protection is certainly a barrier. And we see that because we see businesses saying, our legal team wants to know for sure that this covers what we're doing. And again, even with this expansion, and I should start by saying this is incredibly protective. It basically, like, on the whole, if you take the Food Donation Improvement Act and the Emerson Act together, what it says is businesses that donate food, nonprofits that help them facilitate that donation are protected from all civil and criminal liability in all states. It preempts any state giving less protection. So, like, you're protected anywhere in the country, donating anywhere, as long as the food follows the safety rules, is donated in good faith, which means that you can't be either intentionally donating food is unsafe or being grossly negligent. Like, you're pretty sure it's unsafe and you're passing along, but it's extremely, extremely protective. That said, there's like things that come up on the margins where people ask questions about it. I think the biggest, I would say, is a lack of awareness overall of this law. And I love that, like, that's partly why I'm here today. Like, the more we can tell people that this exists and that it's out there and that it is a real statement on the part of Congress saying, we want people to donate. We want food to get to people who need it. Outside of the liability protection, I think some of the other barriers really, you kind of, one you mentioned, there's cost involved with getting that food along. Allowing protection, even if the food is given away for a low cost, can help with that in some models. But like, if you think about what you need to do to donate food, you need to find a place to store it first. Like let's say you're at a meeting or an event, there needs to be a place you're putting that surplus food. There needs to be some, people that are trained and ready to handle it, which might take some extra time. There's all those costs associated with it. And there are some tax incentives that exist, both at the federal level and then in some states that offset some of that. But the cost, and I think like another big barrier is just that it doesn't cost that much to waste food. So it makes it really easy. It makes it pretty easy to throw it away rather than make a different decision. And so I think it's very easy for businesses or event planners, et cetera, to say, it costs me very little to throw this away. It's not harming me to do it. And even if there's like a small amount of risk or a small amount of cost on the other side, they don't want to take those steps. So, and I hope we're changing that culture.
Well, I was just going to say, can we change it so that it does cost to waste?
Well, I will say that actually has been one of the things we're seeing. A growing number of states are creating what we've now coined as like a category of policies we're calling them food waste deterrence policies. So that includes like bans on sending over a certain amount of food to the landfill. Massachusetts is like an example of a state that does that. It can include states that are requiring donation of safe edible food. So California is like, doing this at scale. They are requiring numerous businesses, including, arenas and big event venues to donate their surplus food.
Wow.
And, we now have 11 states across the country have some version of this. Some are like California, I would say, is at one end of like how specific it is around donation. And on really getting to like enforcement at the local level. Some of them are less heavy-handed, but I think we're going in that direction where it's going to be, costly and penalized to continue to waste food.
Well, and I just think, thinking event-wise too, is like we come in and we do an event, and this is not just food waste too, but we come in and do an event and then we just leave it for that city and that convention center or that hotel to take care of. Right. There's not necessarily a charge to us as the meeting organizer to do that. It doesn't get passed on, which I'm not asking hotels to do that now. Don't pass that on to us at this point. But there should be, maybe there is a penalty. Maybe it is. It would make us all think differently about how we do it. Yeah,
I think that's right. And I think, again, one of the cool things to see is that states and some cities actually are doing these kinds of policies at the city level. Like, they're all experimenting. They're trying to figure out, how do we do this in a way that doesn't have unintended consequences, but that ultimately, day over day, week over week, year over year, we're moving in a direction where we're saying food doesn't belong in the landfill. And I think, like, just to say on that, it's both it's both that there's so many people in need. I think you mentioned at the beginning, like Thanksgiving is coming up. We're all thinking about how grateful we are for what we have, but there's at this moment, 13.5% of households as of the end, as of last year were food insecure. We're seeing that number go up. So there's lots of people who would be delighted to have like safe food that is, that is accessible to them. But also when food goes to the landfill, it's a huge emitter of methane and is really concerning from a climate perspective. So I think, there's a role for everyone. I think like I agree with you. Don't put it necessarily on the meeting and event planners, especially because some are probably coming into a space that they don't know the local landscape, but you all can be educators of, bringing those best practices place to place, almost like ambassadors of like what can be done.
Right, exactly. And we need to be asking the questions up front. I mean, and so when food is donated, and you said earlier tax incentive, that's not necessarily going to come to me as the meeting planner. That's going to come to that property that I'm renting the space from and ordering the food from to get that tax incentive. Is that correct?
I think that's how it would work. I mean, it's a really good question, and maybe one I can like look at a little bit more. But the way it works is basically, I assume the meeting planners are never like the owners of the food, so that's probably correct. But a hotel, or any other, business or entity that's donating food. So from the federal government, they are able to receive a tax credit that covers. It's a little bit complicated, but like the lesser of either the basis value of that, which would be the value that it costs them to acquire that food, or the basis plus half the profit margin. Suffice it to say, it covers more than, covers like a fairly high value of that food, more than you would get if you donated other items. Like people donate clothing or, other in-kind things. You can get a higher value for food than any of those other things. And then businesses can claim up to 15% of their revenue in a tax deduction for food that's donated, which is also a higher cap. Yeah, it's pretty high.
That's huge.
It's huge. And they can carry it forward for 5 years if they don't use it. And I think this is another one, like not enough businesses know that this exists and are not taking advantage of it.
Right. Oh my gosh, that's a large amount of money.
Yeah.
To just be able for just helping feed your community.
Totally. Right. Like you get money for doing something that feels so much better than seeing all that food get thrown out.
Well, and during COVID, I know that there was one story, and this was at the onset, like one event was doing their event and they couldn't because of COVID. And I think it was like within 10 days of the event. So they found an organization within the city and that they paid their fee for the food or however much they did. I have to go find that story. And they ended up donating it instead of the hotel throwing it away. So it became a win-win because we are all now, without food or without jobs. Yeah.
Right. Totally. Like actually we did a big campaign at the beginning of COVID, trying to get the word out to like universities, for example, like they had all this food ready. They're about to serve all these meals and all of a sudden like they shut down. And so I think, I mean, single-handedly, we couldn't get to enough of them, but I think those examples of like, there's all these like unexpected things that happen. That's obviously an extreme version, but unexpected things happen. You think you're having an event, you think you're going to have a certain number of people, like you end up with a lot more food than you need.
Right. So how would you recommend, and putting you on the spot, that a meeting planner, when they're going to a hotel or a convention center or a caterer, add this to their agreement with that that business to make sure that it does get done?
I think that's a great question. I would say a couple of things. One would be like for meeting planners, maybe just having some fact sheets on hand. So one that we have is like basically like a very short couple-page fact sheet explaining the liability protection. We also have one about the tax benefits. That is a little more in depth because it's more complicated, but I can share with you if you want the fact sheet on liability protection. I don't know if I actually pulled it up before this, so I could put it in the chat. And I don't understand who accesses the chat, but I'm going to chat it to you.
If you put it in the private chat, I can add it to the comments.
Yeah. Yeah, perfect. Okay. So
Okay, awesome.
that's one that we put out on the that kind of explains the Emerson Act now with the Food Donation Improvement Act. So
Mm-hmm.
it explains all of the, what do you need to do. So I kind of talked about a couple of it, but the food needs to be, apparently safe or wholesome. I should say the
Mm-hmm.
protection applies not only to food but to other grocery products, which is important.
Okay.
Um, and so I think like having something like that to be able to say, here's the protection. I can share with you later the fact sheet on tax benefits. So
Okay.
the very least saying to venues, do you know about this? This is important. This is something that I value. I don't know. I'm not an event planner. I'm a very poor event planner, having not really done it at scale. But I do think the other thing that's often hardest is just sharing, like, here are the local places where you can make donations and helping like make that connection, which I think you were telling me a story earlier about the barrier just being like making the actual connection and finding the organization and then being able to
Mm-hmm.
donate. And I think like, I know that's also a lot of work to scout out in a new city,
Mm-hmm.
but there are a couple resources on that. There is a map that the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency has
Mm-hmm.
that's called like the excess food opportunities map, and it has layers. Like it includes things like compost facilities as well, but it also includes food banks and food rescue organizations, so that
Uh-huh.
it should be easy to see on the map. I'm in this city, here's what's nearby, and be able to make those like,
I just found that and posted it.
yeah,
That's
yeah. So
awesome.
like make
Okay,
those
cool.
connections and say,
Mm-hmm.
reaching out. We're gonna have this big event. It's on this date. Here's how much we're
Mm-hmm.
gonna have. And I think the nice thing is even if you reach out to one organization and they
Mm-hmm.
can't handle it, a lot of them are very networked. So they might be able to say, all right, that's the timing
Mm-hmm.
doesn't work for us, the quantity, the type of food, but here's the right person and here's how to do that.
Well, yeah, I mean, because that does come into play. Because if you're thinking about an event, you've got pre-made salads, pre-made lasagna, or all these different things, and
Yeah.
depending on the type of community partner that you have, they might not be able to use that. And I know that MGM in Las Vegas is partnered with the food bank there,
Mhm.
and is like flash freezing that food so they can serve it in meals.
Yes, that's great.
But that takes
Yeah.
some extra capital,
Yeah.
for an organization to be able to do that.
Which I think is part of this too, is like, ideally we'd have these venues have a good experience and then and recognize that a lot of it's building on that. Like if there's
Yeah.
an event, they make those relationships and then are able to kind of communicate better in advance and make sure there's the infrastructure that is needed to do that. And I think I guess one thing could be interesting too is having like event planners that are traveling from place to place. Even I don't know if there's like a place where people share ideas or tips, but in this place I partnered with this organization, like almost maintaining a list of
Mm-hmm.
the local organizations that were good partners, especially when you're thinking about it's both the scale but like the type of food. Like it's
Right.
not, as you were sort of saying, it's not all going to be easy for a food bank to take because it might be prepared foods that need to be distributed much more quickly.
Well, you just gave me an idea. So
But
I'll start that. Thank
I
you.
feel like it could be, such a great way
Yeah.
to share. Yeah.
Yeah. And there's quite a few Facebook groups that, I can put that out into to share that, because it is a challenge. And that's where we hear a lot of the griping in, on this topic, frustration,
Right.
and not being able to do
Right.
that. So one of the things I chatted with a woman years ago from Gooder in Atlanta. I forgot her name.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
Forgot her name. But anyways, she was asking me about allergen labeling. And I know that, because she wanted to make sure, like, because when you do that food, it's not labeled.
Right.
Because right now, and we can get into this whole topic of labeling, but I think with the new food code, it recommends it, but doesn't require labeling on unpackaged food.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So that's a challenge in and of itself, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's a good question. I mean, I will say from my work doing this, the organizations out there that are receiving the donated food and passing it along are extremely professional. There are certainly small, like, at the
Hmm.
margins, like smaller organizations that maybe aren't quite as that are, but like they're not likely if you're dealing with like a big event that's not the kind if you're going to be working
Right.
with organizations, they do know what they're doing. I think that they're able to um, you know, receive that information. Like I would think with labeling of food, it could even be like conveying, here's generally what this is, and they're
Hmm.
able to say, okay, they're going to need some sort of like name for the item.
Right.
They may not need the whole list of ingredients. And I think again they do a really good job. Like they recognize they're working often with vulnerable individuals as well. So I think that
Hmm.
they know how to kind of keep that food separated and make sure it's not getting to people who, if there may be an allergen in it that isn't disclosed. Um, yeah.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, it's a challenge in general, right?
Yeah.
So we
Yeah.
we can talk about that whole conversation on another show. One of the questions that I asked you before we got on the show was a best practice that you've seen in all of this in making sure that food gets donated. And you did your own conference, is that right?
Oh yeah, I would love to talk about ours.
Yeah.
So we hosted two pretty big food recovery like conferences here at Harvard Law School. One in 2016 and one in 2018. And like, big for us, 350 people. I think that, pretty big.
Hmm.
Not like,
Right.
And at that time, I was having a hard time getting our institution to allow us to donate food. So
Hmm.
they were like, we're not going to let you donate after. So what we decided to do for both of those conferences was that we procured all surplus food to be prepared into our meals. So this meant we worked with our dining hall here. We actually brought in a consultant to help source
Hmm.
food. And what we did was we like work with them, we let them know this was coming a couple months before. It was actually a little bit after commencement. So they ended up freezing some of the food that they had prepared for commencement that didn't get served. So they served some of that. They re-prepared it in different ways. We like sourced some fruits and vegetables that, from farms that had surplus, that kind of thing. And our food management company here at the time was able to turn all of that into meals. And when we labeled everything, like this is, this chicken, it came from commencement, we did like, and we actually
Wow.
had the chef come out for, I think, the second one of them. And he said, basically every single thing you're eating is recovered except for a couple of the spices. And there was one other item that they needed to source a little bit to make up for like a deficit of what they were able to get from recovered
Right.
food. It was amazing.
Wow. Wow.
Cool.
And how many meals? Was that just like one meal per
No, it
event?
was like I think it was 5 meals over 2 days.
Wow. And it was all from surplus food. Wow.
It was
Because of
pretty
over ordering
yeah,
or leftovers
yeah,
and things like that.
yep,
Yeah, I remember at Slow Foods conference in Denver, Slow Food Denver, and Steven Satterfield was responsible from Atlanta was responsible for doing that and using all the food left over from the festival for our final dinner,
yeah,
and it was delicious.
right, yeah, exactly,
Yeah,
totally. Well, it's so
yeah.
funny, when I first started working in this space, like, the first thing that I got into working on was actually date labels, which we can also it's probably
Yeah.
less I don't know how much that plays into, more prepared food side, but also they're a big cause of food waste because people don't understand them. Businesses
Hmm.
don't know if they when or if they can donate after the date. Consumers
Hmm.
throw food away, etc. So when I started working on that, I had a couple experiences where I went to someone's house for dinner, and at the end of the meal, they said, "Oh, I didn't want to tell you at the beginning, but all the food that we ate was sourced from like." I retrieved from like trash cans and whatever. I felt like, all right, I mean, I'm down, but it seems like something you might want to tell someone at the beginning of the meal. But I had a bunch of delicious meals. So kind of, I think, when you see what's possible,
Hmm.
it requires some creativity, but I think like you can have a delicious, wonderful meal. And I actually think part of what's really important is like reducing the stigma of donated food too. We all should be, eating from our leftovers and like saving things up. It should be for everyone, but especially it doesn't make sense to throw it away when there are so many people that are in need.
Well, and the way you said that, it reminded me of a conversation I had at IMEX, which is our largest meetings industry conference last month, and with Trevor Liu out of Toronto. And he said, we need to stop telling, we need to reframe what we're doing and calling it, instead of we're donating the waste to people, we're thinking about it as a giving opportunity from the beginning. Right. And because we don't want to make people think like they're other and, oh, here's our trash. Right.
Totally. I think that's right. There's actually been this debate in this space for a while about like calling it food waste, which it's really hard because now everyone finally understands what that is. It's hard to change it, but I think there is this really important piece where we're misnaming something, and I think there's some power to the fact that calling it that is making it sound like it's not good for people, and I think so I like the idea of giving. It's surplus, it's excess. A lot of it isn't waste. It's like too much. It's mostly too much. There's lots of reasons, but like a lot of it is just, we're having an event, we're having a meeting. We didn't know exactly how much we needed. It's awkward when you run out, so we have too much.
Right. Yeah. And so we're feeding the community with our surplus.
Yeah.
I like that. Yeah. Right. There's a comment that just came in here. Julie just said, that's a great point. It's extra. What are we doing with our extra?
Yeah.
Or our leftovers.
Yeah.
I mean, leftovers is still leftovers works in your kitchen refrigerator, but not necessarily when we're doing it for donating to a community organization. Have you seen a lot of good programs that have started because of this since the FDIA was enacted?
It's a great question. So I know I haven't seen new things necessarily yet, although I'm excited. And like, if anyone out there knows of new things, let me know. I can tell you a couple of things that this is allowing that were really hard to do before. So let me give you a couple examples. One is actually the first client that I ever worked for that got me into date labels and then all this food waste stuff was an organization here in Massachusetts, in Boston, called Daily Table, which is what's called a social supermarket. They're common in other countries. They're not so common here, but they are taking a lot of, like donated or in some cases purchasing surplus and selling it in a nonprofit grocery store at extremely low prices. And the issue that they were having, that entity or things like that, was donors that gave food to them before under federal law couldn't claim protection because the food was being sold at a low price. But they're filling a really big hole. Like, I think if you think about recipients of food from food banks, for example, like they're, it's a lot of people don't want to get food for free. They would rather pay a little bit of money. Even if they can only go a certain amount of time. Like, they can't be there every day. Like, they're, you could pick up a certain amount of times a month. So it was, really filling a gap for people. And again, on this point of really seeing the individuals getting that food as customers rather than as beneficiaries. So you go in, it's your choice what you want to buy or don't buy anything. Anyway, so they were able to start that because Massachusetts had already protection for donated food that was sold at a low price. But all these other states, people have kept reaching out over the years saying, we want to start something in our state, and they didn't have that same protection. So my hope is we'll start to see things like this, which now has been extremely successful here. They've expanded to multiple stores, take off. And then the other example that we saw was in the space of like direct donation. This comes up, first of all, comes up a lot with restaurants. Like, they'll say, at the end of the night, we don't have that much food. It's not like an event. They're like, food banks don't want our small scale of food, and we're afraid to give it away directly. The other example was schools. So schools also, they have a lot of food. Previously, because of the way the Emerson Act was structured, if they wanted to have protection, they needed to give that food away to like a nonprofit that then would distribute it to people in need. And what a lot of schools were realizing was it's our own students and their families that need this food. It doesn't make any sense to send it across town. It might go bad along the way. So a couple states had passed a state law saying that an individual within that school could like be the stand-in for a nonprofit. And so you're basically giving it to a nonprofit in the person of like one of your teachers who you announce is part of that nonprofit. It was a total workaround to give protection to schools so that they could give food away. And now that is part
That's
of what's
awesome.
covered kind of nationally. So I think I know a lot of the examples of what people were trying to do and trying to expand. And
Right.
I'm hopeful that more of this is happening and we'll continue to see innovation that this allows.
Well, and it brings up like two different stories that I have. One is, so there's a school nutritionist in Virginia, in Western Virginia, that I interviewed. And she actually started a school refrigerator program.
Mm-hmm.
And it actually allowed the kids saying, hey, if I don't like milk or I can't have milk, they can go put it in the refrigerator themselves. And then another one of their classmates can take it out. So it reduces that carton of milk going into the trash can. And it helps those kids give back to each other.
Right. And what this allows is, so you now have these like a share table or share fridge or whatever in schools. And then at the end of the day, if any of that's still left, schools can feel like we can give this, to like a lot of schools have started backpack programs or things where they realize, some of the kids are so in need that over the weekend they go home or over like spring break or something, and they don't have a resource for food in that time period. So I think it, again, it doesn't require schools to do that, but it allows them to use that food for those benefits. And I think, again, we saw that lots of schools were trying to do this, and we're just really cautious about not wanting to do something that wasn't protected.
Well, yeah, and then the other one is the community fridge programs in general. Those popped up during COVID, I think, really fluently, and not everywhere. But my friend Sarah started one here in North Carolina, Feedwell Fridges, and so she gets donations from restaurants and grocery stores and things daily, and she's preparing all that food and putting it in refrigerators versus I know ones in other places, like the restaurant can go put that excess food in that fridge, directly.
Yeah, which is great. And actually this liability protection is helpful for that too. We actually, in the middle of COVID, we did a project where we interviewed a bunch of the kind of community fridge, like mutual aid organizations or whoever was staffing them, to ask, what are the legal questions that are coming up for you? And a big one that came up was, do we have protection? Do the people putting the food in the fridge have protection? Especially, let's say it is a restaurant or something like that. And what we found is that they do. It's even clearer now with this protection for some of those direct donations. But like even before, I mean, it's very clear that is protected. And the really interesting thing with community fridges, like I'm a really big fan. I recognize that there's things about them that are hard, especially to like keep them up over the long term, just because they need to like be cleaned out from time to time. And, but
so do corporate refrigerators.
That's true. Exactly. But like, I think, in, having that schedule of people who are responsible and are going to come clean out and everything. But I'd seen community fridges in other countries from some of my work, and prior to COVID, I thought like these will never happen in the U.S. We're too litigious. We're like too, it's not like we're not good at having things that have this sort of like unclear, like ownership structure. And it was very, very cool to see them pop up. And I think, again, like some of them have been extremely successful.
Yeah, I know there's like in Des Moines, there's like 80 fridges across Des Moines, which my friend started that program too. A different friend started that program. Yeah. So when we're protected, but when a hotel or a convention center or a restaurant starts a relationship with XYZ nonprofit, do they need to have some kind of legal agreement in that they're doing this, and or what should they provide anything, talk to their lawyers about how they're doing this?
It's a great question. I mean, like in order to receive the liability protection, there doesn't need to be any, documentation or agreement. Okay. And what's interesting is typically where I'm talking to businesses that are setting up like an ongoing relationship, which some of them might be like the venues themselves. Ideally, if, this all goes well, like they would set up an ongoing relationship with a food bank or a
Right.
food recovery organization. In those cases, I would say, it can't hurt to have like an MOU that just lays out expectations, but
Hmm.
as a legal matter that isn't needed to receive the protection. I think it just helps everyone know who's doing what and like how often are the pickups going to be or like whatever
Hmm.
those details are. Um, but I think again, if event planners who are going from place to place are able to help break that down, I do think what we see is once organizations donate, they realize it was easier than they thought it would be.
Hmm.
They have to do the work of understanding the liability protection or the tax in a way that like before they could just be like, it's hard, there's liability. Like once they do it once, I think it really is like it's sort of like riding a bike. They do it once, they realize, wow, this was great and it had all these other benefits. And I think what we hear often is like employees that are helping with doing donations actually like really value it. It's very
Hmm.
demoralizing to work with food and be the one throwing it away all the time. So
Yeah.
I think we generally hear that once businesses start doing this, they want to continue.
Well, and glad that you said that because you never know about the person you're working next to, right? You don't know if they're going using WIC or, when they're not with you, right? They're getting their meals at work, but you don't know what's going on at home. And there was a video on that yesterday on LinkedIn, but not around food, but just other things that you just don't know what's going on in someone's life. And a woman from the Society of Incentive Travel Executives from Spain
Mhm.
was telling me something similar years ago, that she was at an event and she found one of the front of the house staff throwing filet mignon in the trash after the event, and she was crying. And she's like, "Why are you crying?" And she's like, "Because I can't afford to buy this on my own, outside of work, and my boss is having me throw it in the trash."
Totally. Totally. It's demoralizing. Like I
Yeah.
think people, are it can contribute to a lot better like culture among staff knowing that they're
Hmm.
doing the right thing
Right.
rather
Yeah.
than, I totally
Yeah.
agree with that. I totally agree. And I think like Um, I think a cool thing too to think about for event planners is maybe using this as an edge in, I'm not only gonna plan your event, I'm gonna help make sure that the surplus food gets to a good location that doesn't
Hmm.
get wasted. I'm gonna leave you with some knowledge about how to make sure to do that in the future.
Right. Exactly. And I think with all the ESGs and the
Mhm.
SDGs, environmental, social, and governance
Yep,
regulations,
yep.
and social, and the
Sustainable
UN's
development
sustainable
goals.
development goals,
I know,
it
all
plays
the alphabet soup.
exactly. But it gives the meeting professionals another leg up in
Yeah.
that seat in the table to saying, "Hey, we're helping to meet our company goals by doing this."
Yeah, I think that's right. And I do think we also, in addition to working a lot on food waste policies in the US, we've actually been doing a lot of global work through a project where we've compared policies across now 25 countries. We've
Oh,
documented like what are
wow.
their laws on food waste and food donation and who is the best ones and how can countries change their policies. Like, for example, passing a liability protection law or creating tax incentives that don't exist. And what we're seeing is actually a lot of movement in places where companies are doing reporting on like ESG or on scope 3 emissions and
Okay.
food documenting how much food they waste and what they do with it is becoming more and more important. So I think we're going in this direction. I think it is a moment where there's probably an edge that event planners and venues can have in saying, here, we're doing the better thing. But I think
Hmm.
it's going to hopefully, we're moving in a direction where it's going to be much more difficult and costly to just like do business as usual and like throwing food
Right.
away in an unlimited
Right.
way.
Well, and I from the planning perspective too, is like really knowing your numbers. So to reducing your waste in the first place, I
Mhm.
think that should be number one goal. But when you do have excess, how can we give it to those communities?
Yes, definitely. I'm glad you mentioned that. And I
Yeah.
think there's this sort of food recovery hierarchy. The US now calls it a wasted food scale, but at the top is always prevent. And that is really important too. Like do the best you can to figure out exactly what you really need to order and
Hmm.
and like over time, seeing the things that end up getting wasted, like don't overorder those things.
Right.
But yeah, the number one thing below that would be getting the food to people. There are lots of other things to do, getting food to animals. Again, there's lots of other things you can do with it before it goes into a landfill, or for
Right.
that matter, into a garbage disposal, which I think I just learned actually is actually from a methane perspective worse for some
Oh,
reason.
really?
Yes.
Oh,
Yes.
wow.
And again, I
Okay.
think at this scale, we're probably not putting it in the garbage disposal from a giant event, but maybe, I don't
Right.
know. But
Right.
it's not better.
Well, and I can't compost in my backyard because we have bears, and he tore down the bird feeder the other day.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah. So what do you wish? I saw something that there too many laws, cause too many problems, et cetera. But what do you wish people knew about what you do at the food? I'm going to get it right. The Food Law and Policy Clinic.
Yeah. I would say the number one thing is that everything we do is responding to, needs and questions that are coming from like businesses and nonprofits and governments. So every single project we have started from like someone coming to us with a question and us trying to help answer it. And that is like our number one goal, is to take the legal knowledge and then put it in the hands of people who have other expertise, like expertise in planning events or running a food business or whatever. And so I think that's first. And then over time, when we hear a lot of the same questions, we'll put out bigger like reports or toolkits or fact sheets, because we realize, lots of people are asking this, and a more efficient way to answer it is by doing that. But I think it's very much like we have one tool in the toolkit, and I think in big societal problems like food waste, like we're not going to solve it alone, but hopefully we can be part of sharing the knowledge and expertise we have with others to answer those questions and make it easier. So I think that's the thing I wish people all knew and understood, and like could find ways to partner with us better.
Yeah. Okay. So 2 more questions, because what would be the first step for a meeting professional, whether it's a hotel or a planner, to take to make sure they're covered or not covered, because they are covered, but to make sure that they can move forward in making donations?
I would say the first steps, like one, I think would be I gave you a fact sheet, like, educating themselves briefly. And again, I understand like people hear like liability and they get really freaked out, but we tried to break it down really simply. And I think the biggest takeaway is, almost anything you would be doing would be covered unless you're passing forward food that is unsafe, which seems hard for me to imagine someone's doing. But like having like, the basic facts so that you can communicate them to the venue you're working with. And then I would say, to the extent you're able to also bring to the table either volunteering that you will make the connection, or you already know one or two of the organizations locally that are able to partner with you to recover that food. And again, that's sometimes the hardest part. So I think like being able to do that, especially if you work a lot in one location, get to know those one or two organizations, so you can say to the folks you're planning the event for, I know that we're covered. The tax piece is another added benefit, and it can help make those connections for you.
Okay, that's awesome. Yeah, my brain is already spinning on ways that I can help do this, because it's such an important topic, and we need to be feeding the people. And especially, I think I saw a stat that the price of food went up like double-digit percentage, the cost of food.
Yeah, I know.
And it's going to be harder for people to get food on their table.
Yep, totally. I think that's right. I mean, one thing I'm actually doing, like more on an academic side because it's less applicable in the US, but a growing number of countries that recognize the right to food are saying that like large amounts of food waste are a violation of that right. So we saw a court case in Pakistan doing that. A new law in Mexico says food must be donated because throwing all this food away is violating the right to food. So I think, again, we don't.
Oh, I love that.
Believe in the right to food, but I think like we can all relate to the concept and say, this is a violation of what we are supposed to be doing if we're just like throwing away thousands of pounds of food per year. 38% of food in the US gets wasted every year.
Right. And I direct that to so I think it's $64 billion that, and this is a 2016 number from the Events Industry Council, that US planners spend $64 billion a year on food and beverage. And if 38%, or I rounded up to 40, that's $21 billion.
Yeah.
And so if you even if you had $100,000 budget and 40 or for food and beverage, that's $40,000 that it's going thrown away. What could you do with that $40,000?
Totally. And it's like $40,000 is probably even the value is higher because if you're buying it at a large scale, it's like, again, I think, I think it's a great time for people to be thinking about this. It's a season that we're thinking about what we're grateful for and hopefully thinking about how can we make sure that other people have those opportunities too.
Right. Yep. Exactly. All right. My final question that I ask everybody is, what does a safe, sustainable, and inclusive food and beverage experience look like from your perspective?
Well, the sustainable is easy. I think, we talked about already, like making sure, thinking about the sourcing. We didn't really talk about the sourcing, but there are also things you can do on the sourcing side if you're really concerned about food waste. And some of that's things like there's a new, upcycled food certification and like this idea of getting food that already you're buying things that would have been wasted or imperfect foods. If you're preparing them, it doesn't matter if the apple's perfect, if it's going to be chopped up and put into salads or whatever. So what are the things you can do? But it's really like making sure that there's not a lot of waste at the end and making sure food that's safe can be donated. As far as like safe and inclusive, I think a lot of that is, we talked about labeling. I know it's hard, but I think the transparency piece of it is most important, that people know what they're getting and that they, from the inclusive side, there's lots of people eating different types of diets and making sure people have the choice, but also the knowledge about what they're getting so that they're not getting something that's not for them.
Right. Exactly. And I just posted the upcycled food certification. I saw them at Natural Products Expo, I guess.
Okay. Very cool.
Yeah.
Yeah. The one thing I didn't share with you was our tax guidance. Do you want me to see if I can get that and share it with you really quick?
That would be great. Yeah.
Let me see if I can pull it up real quick and chat it to you so you can.
And then Julie also commented, it breaks her heart to see the food thrown away.
And I should say the tax deduction also.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm grabbing you the link to our tax guidance. This one is not as simple as the this opened up really weirdly. I might need to share it with you afterwards.
Okay.
Not here. Let's see if this works. Okay.
Alrighty.
So the tax guidance is a little more tricky, I would say, on that. Like, don't, just alerting the venues, or other, other folks you're working with too about this. But but it's a really, and I should say, I mentioned we've been comparing laws around countries, and the U.S. has the strongest liability protection and the best tax incentives of any country we've looked at.
Wow, that's huge. So why wouldn't you be looking at it? Yeah.
Totally. Yeah. So.
Okay. I've posted
it. And I think I would say here, you know what? Let me give one other tip. Last year we launched a food waste policy coalition called the Zero Food Waste Coalition that we launched in partnership with World Wildlife Fund, Natural Resources Defense Council, and ReFed. But we now have over 200 members, and we have members with presence in all 50 states. And we're kind of working together on how do we continue to make these better. Things like the Food Donation Improvement Act. Like that was a lot of people saying we want to see this change. And so I think there's also an opportunity to get involved if you see barriers, any barrier you're facing, that is solvable. Like, get involved in helping be part of those like systems level solutions. So I would like welcome anyone who wants to talk about joining. It is membership's open to organizations, not individuals, but we share a whole lot of resources on the website that are open to anybody. So that would be another thing to do if you feel like you want to do even more than what you're doing and help kind of make this part of the systems we see in the future.
Okay, cool. Awesome. And it's a Google form, so it's easy to complete that, to be part of it. Yeah, very cool. This is so important, and I really appreciate your work, and I would love to have you on to talk about other policies that are coming around that are related to food, because this is all about food, the show.
Sounds great. Sounds good.
Next week, I actually have somebody on the show talking about the labeling on alcohol.
Oh.
That's the regulations that are coming around alcohol labeling. So cool. Allergens as well as just nutritional information. Yep.
Which is really interesting. Like for so long that we didn't have any of that.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And I met a woman this week who's got alpha gal syndrome, which is the mammalian meat allergy or the mammalian allergy. And it's hard to find drinks and things that, like, she was telling me what Pepsi she can't have, but she can have Coke. Because it's got some kind of mammalian product in it. Who knew?
Yeah.
Right.
So interesting. Yeah. Great.
Yeah. Well, Emily, thank you so much for being here. And and if everybody, you can reach Emily. She is on LinkedIn, but you can also reach her. Let's do that and edit it, and I'll put the website there too. Save and show. There's your website.
Great.
So everybody can reach out to her there. But thank you so much for the work that you're doing, you and all your students.
Thank you. I know. It's amazing. I mean, it's amazing what you can do with an army of like energized, activated young people.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I think they're very activated to save the planet. So yeah. All right, everybody. And likewise, thank you so much. Everybody, until next week, stay safe and eat well, and make sure you're figuring out some way to make a food donation from your events. And actually chime in here and let me know what let Emily and I know what you are doing, so that we can track it. So I thank you. All right. Have a good day.